Greetings friends and welcome to the Imperium's Most Wanted. I'm Lorcan and this is Only War. For this special two-part edition of the series, we're going to look at arguably one of the most influential figures in the entire 40k setting, well deserving of being the first two-part special on the channel. In this first chapter, The Rise of the Spider, we'll look at his story from walking in the presence of the Emperor himself and using his genius in a desperate fight to save his brothers, through his descent beyond the bounds of ethics and morality to being instrumental to the fall of his entire legion. Before we start, I just want to thank everyone for the support and comments. We've grown a lot this month, well beyond anything I anticipated, so thank you all. After considering some of your comments and planning out some things, I will shortly be opening a Patreon account. So if you are in the position to consider helping kickstart the channel, it will be linked in video descriptions in the future. Even a small contribution would make a huge difference towards the goal of being able to produce the best quality Warhammer videos I can, and on a more regular basis as soon as possible. With that out the way, I'm grateful if you're already subscribed, and if you're new to the channel, I hope you enjoy this edition of the Imperium's Most Wanted, and I earn your subscription today, as we discuss the rise to prominence and lasting influence of a man who could easily lay claim to a spot right at the top of the Imperium's Most Wanted. In a history spanning 10 millennia of atrocities, he is a man of many titles and aliases, all apt in their own right. The Chief Apothecary, the Clone Lord, the Primogenitor, a man hated and feared by the very legion he once struggled alone to save in the days before their reunion with their Primarch. Fabius Bile, the spider at the centre of the fall of the Emperor's children. His webs tangling and binding the legion to their Primarch's fall, as his venom coursed through their veins and the arachnid limbs of the chirurgeon changed them beyond recognition to the warriors once held in the highest favour of the Imperium. Relatively little is known about the man who would eventually come to be known as Fabius Bile. He was born on ancient Terra in a place called Ingolstadt in northern Europa, as the son of a minor noble house. Even he remembers little outside of it being mountainous and racked by storms, but he did remember the library, one containing real books, that and the presence of music, a preference he would always hold as he worked. In a later memory, Fabius recalls an old family retainer who possessed artificial hands of archaic design, that while unnerving in their clicking skeletal form, he could use to produce the most wondrous creations of mechanics and flesh that fascinated the young Fabius. It was from this man that Fabius first learnt the basics of flesh crafting, how to stretch and reattach musculature and reshape bone for the sheer pleasure of marvelling in the creation of new life forms. Through his work on these animal chimeras and trained implanted creations, he first learned how to dull pain and increase pleasure in his creations, so he could work on them more easily. Fabius did fail in his most ambitious project, and the old man left him with a notion he would carry forward with some importance: the inherent fallibility of flesh. No matter how altered or stripped away the flesh may be, the essence, the soul of a being remains unchanged, and in the end, it is only the soul that matters. This would be the final lesson the old man would impart on the young Fabius, who was part of the next flesh tithe bound for the Terran holdings of the Third Legion. As the Great Crusade pushed out into the wider galaxy, an immediate problem became apparent: the diminishing stability of the gene seed itself. The need for greater numbers of Space Marines in the field had led to the overuse of the available stock, and the situation was only worsening. Unwilling to slow his campaign, the Emperor directed a secret conclave of gene rights that posited a solution that would become known as Grabia's Theorem. This involved using the Primarch's genetic code to stabilize and expand the gene stocks. This solution to prevent the deterioration of the gene stock combined with advances to gene culturing techniques, would also reduce the time of Space Marine creation significantly. With the pacification of the gene cults of Luna and the Martian Compact sealed, new Astartes could be produced and equipped at an unprecedented rate to meet the demands of the Great Crusade. For the gene forges of Luna to begin the process, a portion of each legion's gene stock reserve was sent there from Terra, and the first blow to the third occurred when the ship carrying their gene seed was lost in mysterious circumstances. Although Fabius would find out many centuries later that the Necron overlord Trazan the Infinite ended up in possession of the gene tithe. The loss of the 3rd Legion's gene seed reserve, while a severe blow, would not have endangered the survival of the Legion alone, but for a second successive calamity that would also befall the 3rd. A fast-acting viral gene blight infected several of the gene vaults on Terra, its cause and origin unknown at the time. It was later revealed to be a Selenite plot, an act of vengeance from the ancient gene cults conquered during the pacification of Luna. Their equipment, skills and knowledge had been turned to the increased production of Astartes at the behest of the Emperor, but hostile Selenar elements were still able to unleash the disease into the Terran-held stocks. Only the intervention of the Emperor himself halted the spread of the blight, and while several legions suffered losses, the entire gene stock of the 3rd Legion was destroyed. It was around this time that Fabius left his family holdings on Terra to join the 3rd Legion, and although the exact record of that intake has been mysteriously lost, it is likely he received some of the last of that potentially tainted Terran gene stock. Typically of the noble stock of Northern Europa, Fabius was fair-skinned with blonde hair, and following gene implementation, he had violet pupils to his eyes. He joined a legion whose only means of survival was the removal of the progenoid glands of their dead, and with their Primarch undiscovered, attempts to rebuild their gene seed reserves were painfully slow. The 3rd Legion were still pivotal to a number of victories in the early years of the Great Crusade, their wider contributions often being overshadowed by other legions. But on the world of Proxima, the Emperor explicitly recognized their position in his esteem. The 3rd Legion's 16th cohort had been assigned to the Proxima compliance ceremonies as part of the Emperor's honor guard, when insurrectionists armed with a vortex weapon almost succeeded in an assassination attempt on the Emperor himself. The Legion's warriors alongside the Legio Custodes only just managed to enable his escape, but the price was high as they died virtually to the man. Proxima paid for that insult with Exterminatus, and the Emperor's children earned the right to bear the Palatine Aquila for their service and sacrifice. But despite the honour attained, the cost on their already depleted ranks was significant. With each engagement, the 3rd Legion's strength dwindled, and while many of his brothers could still revel in the glory of their victories, Fabius was already becoming distant from them, aware of the futility of his attempts, even as he sought to retrieve all he could from the dead of each battlefield. In the solar year that followed, Apothecary Fabius was confronted with the reality that the blight that had decimated the gene seed reserves on Terra was also present in the warriors of the Legion. As he struggled to retrieve enough progenoid glands from his fallen brothers to maintain combat effectiveness, Fabius found more and more tainted samples. He reflected at the time that the rapid entropy affecting the Legion was far beyond his efforts to contain, despairing that his only meaningful task was to compile the lexicon of the infected. He became even more detached, even to those closest to him, and admitted the nature of his work making him desensitized, their losses becoming biomatter to be catalogued, rather than brothers to be mourned. He admitted to one such former close friend, a Marine called Lycaon, that his studies into the Blight had found instances in a broad spectrum of legionaries. Those with gene seed originating from the last of the Terran Reserve made up the majority of the cases, however, the stock that both Lycaon and Fabius could have come from. Fabius shares his first findings, and that he is reaching the point of being able to successfully test for the degenerative viral contagion, but but a cure was not within sight. Fabius would give his assessment that barring the miraculous, the Legion's demise not only seemed inexorable, but inevitable. Next came the time that would forever estrange Fabius from most of the other Legion veterans. In an attempt to purge the Legion of the Blight, all infected gene seed was to be destroyed with immediate effect. However, this purging edict, which must have come from Terra, would extend to all sworn brothers of the Legion who showed any evidence of any base-level abnormality. As Fabius was the one tasked with sampling and testing of his Legion, he became the most feared and hated figure within it. As keeper of the lexicon, he became an executioner, deciding by scientific method which of his brothers would live or die, regardless of how able-bodied and healthy they may appear, or their deeds in the Legion. Pushing aside the loathing of those around him for the cold detachment with which he condemned his brothers, and Fabius did indeed start to see them as little more than biological matter to be studied, he fell further into the obsessive personality traits he had shown even before joining the Third. The executions and immediate dissection of those identified as carrying the Blight left his name cursed by those who remained. It was during this time that Fabius started using an artifact of his own devising that would evolve over time into the Chirurgeon, an armature with 4 mechanical multi-jointed limbs that extended from its power battery. He wore it like a carapace shell upon his back, the arms extended over his shoulders, and slaved to the auto-mnemonic responses much like his armour. It was heavy, but tolerable against Fabius's transhuman frame. The increasing frequency with which the device was attached to Fabius would soon lead to the bestowing of his first title, given in loathing despite Fulgrim's later attempts to suggest otherwise. He became known as the Spider. Fabius's diligence in his task soon led to tissue sampling from a random cross-section of the legionaries, revealing an end to the taint, though by that time he considered their numbers so few as to be regarded almost extinct. In order for his genetic cataloguing to be considered comprehensive, he added his own samples to the data. His initial analysis was not reassuring. Knowing that he would not be exempted from the purgation order, he justified that, in order to maintain his research, he would need to hide his own personal results in the record. Whether he did this by committing the ultimate betrayal of his close friend Lycaon and switching their results is unclear, but needless to say, Lycaon would end up on Fabius's lexicon, judged as impure, and after his execution would end up a reanimated thrall in Fabius's service. In time, the Great Crusade would bring the Legion into the presence of their gene sire Fulgrim on the planet of Chemos. While Fabius could rejoice in the renewed ability to synthesize gene seed the reunion with the Primarch would bring, and that there was a world of healthy, hardy candidates ready for implementation at his immediate disposal, he still knew that while he had successfully hidden his own infection, and the degeneration he suffered was only currently minor, he could not escape his own prognosis. The reunion of father and son was warm, and the accession of Chemos into the Imperial fold smooth and eagerly accomplished. Fulgrim would be given charge of the dying Third Legion, numbering only 200, with Fabius among them. Each one of them was said to have held a banner of a company either perished or disbanded, but bore themselves proudly in defiance of their apparent fate. When Fulgrim knelt in front of his sons proclaiming they must throw off the misfortunes of the past and rise to the heights others dare not, when he proclaimed them the Emperor's chosen, his heralds, his children, the name the Emperor ratified with an imperial decree, Fabius would be the only surviving member of the Legion's Apothecarion among those 200 Terran veterans. His efforts had prevented the utter obliteration of the Third Legion and allowed them to become the Emperor's children. They were still a shattered remnant compared to most of their brother legions. Even with the rapid synthesis of gene seed the presence of Fulgrim allowed, and intakes of recruits from Chemos, Terra, and other worlds, the Emperor still saw the need for their recovery to be carefully nurtured, so he assigned Horus to mentor Fulgrim and his legion. For many of the next years of the Great Crusade, the two Primarchs and their legions grew close bonds of brotherhood, their differing temperaments and methods of waging war blending and complementing each other well in many arenas of war. From the moment Fulgrim knelt before them in humility, the Emperor's children felt as though the achievements of the legions past counted for nothing, and only the deeds in their future were important, and they pursued all matters with total dedication until mastery was achieved, then evaluated and refined further. Unfortunately, despite his own dedication to the initial eradication of the Blight, Fabius discovered it was reoccurring in the Legion, despite the infusion of fresh, supposedly untainted gene stock, and the fact it was spreading through the new recruits was undeniable. Once they had sufficient numbers, Fulgrim and his legion would finally leave Horus and his Lunar Wolves to take command of the 28th Expedition Fleet, and Fulgrim relished the opportunity to finally bring systems into compliance in his own way. The first mission was to Byzaz, the only planet in its system capable of sustaining life, with a population of several billion. Fulgrim selected just 6 of his legion to send to the planet. Fabius was one of them, and the only of their number from the 200 who'd knelt before their Primarch on Chemos. Fulgrim was determined to engage in a new method of war, perfect in its conception and practice, and tasked the 6 to bring Byzaz into compliance. Of the 6, Fabius already stood out as different in his countenance. Lord Commander Abdimon, the hero of Proxima, calls him talented but prone to thinking he was above the chain of command. Fulgrim was already aware of Fabius, and as the only surviving member of the Legion's Apothecarian, knew for a time he had struggled alone to stave off the blight that affected his Gene sons. Despite that, Fulgrim felt Fabius carried with him a cynicism that was at odds with what the Primarch believed the Emperor's children were to stand for. Fulgrim had selected the group split evenly between those of Terran birth and those from Chemos, but the presence of the man who had already gained the moniker the Spider unsettled the others. Even then, Fabius was gaunt and sallow-skinned, with a dogged determination and dedication to his work above all else. He would have risen high in the ranks of the Apothecarian if he'd had a mind to do so, but the trappings of rank meant nothing to him. Only his work mattered. Despite being the only surviving apothecary of the Legion, and them having no master, Fabius's rank did not reflect as such, and he'd refused the honour since Fulgrim's arrival. His Primarch suspected at the time this was a combination of humility and spite. Despite his total dedication to continuing his own studies, the Legion's Apothecarian began to flourish under his care. He was a skilled teacher, held in awe by the newer recruits despite the mutterings of the veterans who knew the lengths he had gone to when the Blight took hold through their ranks. It was here for the first time that Fabius reveals what would seem an obvious truth, that the Blight was not an outside agent alone, but an internal flaw that affected even those drawn more recently from Chemos. Fulgrim is, at that moment, forced to confront the possibility that the malignant flaw may also be his. After the attempted assassination of the hereditary governor and Fulgrim's delegation, one survivor was turned over to Fabius, who extracted not only the information of the plots at hand, but also tested the physiology of the native for suitability for gene implementation. Fabius felt no guilt at his bloody task, and Fulgrim once again paused, wondering if bringing the spider out from his web was the right choice. During a month that saw a number of other assassinations foiled, and Fulgrim attempt to negotiate the political landscape to avoid hostilities, Fabius continued his genetic studies on the planet's population, by now taking genetic samples from the tribes of mutants that inhabited the irradiated glass wastes of the planet. When questioned what these mutants could offer the glorious Third Legion, Fabius's answer is telling. It's so easy for you, all of you. Your enemy is across the field always, but my enemy is harder to bring to battle. My enemy is our very blood and bone, and strikes where I least suspect at every turn. We are imperfect, Alkenex. Every one of us. Our genetic code is as rotten as those of these creatures you so casually dismiss as animals. but somehow they survive, where we do not. Why are we so fragile, brother? A twist in the helix and we break like twigs. Answer me that, eh? Use that fancy sword of yours and carve me a path to the truth. In the aftermath of a rebellion against the planned compliance, Fabius is tasked by Fulgrim to begin the process of gene implementation in the sons of all the renegade patricians of the planet. He also promotes Fabius to chief apothecary despite his protestations that he has done nothing worthy of the honour, that his efforts have been imperfect and flawed. But Fulgrim's response is careful and measured, claiming they are all imperfect, and that perfection is a process to be achieved. The 28th expedition would soon become engaged in what would be known as the cleansing of Leiran, the third world they would bring into compliance. First contact with the Xenos Leia had shown them to be an alien race of some sophistication, with technology capable of matching and in some cases even exceeding that of the Imperium. Although initially not hostile, they had reacted violently as the scout ships approached their homeworld. However, their vessels were no match for the full force of Fulgrim's fleet, and soon the Emperor's children had fully blockaded the planet. It was an oceanic world where only the highest peaks of what were once mountain ranges rose above the mighty seas, and the bulk of Leia society existed on a number of city-sized coral atolls that floated through the sky above the oceans on plumes of searing energy, powered by coiled devices of unknown origin and function. In appearance, each Leia could be wildly diverse, their bioforms differing between war zones, and apparently engineered for each particular theatre of war. A sinuous snake-like lower body was common to all, and the muscular thoraxes sheathed in silver armour. Their heads were insect-like and bulbous, with multifaceted eyes and jutting mandibles that produced a grating screech when the Leia attacked. The limb arrangement in particular varied, with some even sporting wings. The Emperor's children fought the Leia across the planet. While the war raged, Fabius directed his menials in the Apothecarian aboard the Pride of the Emperor in dissecting and studying their Xenos foe. He found that while genetically identical, in the sense of being from the same gene strand, the internal workings had been modified both genetically and chemically from birth to fulfill a predetermined role in the Xenos society. In reporting his findings to his Primarch, he came to the conclusion that the Leia altering their physical makeup was simply a step on the road to perfection, and that perhaps they too could look upon their flesh and find new ways to improve further on the Emperor's work. In his words, they should put aside notions of squeamishness or reverence that would limit the third from achieving perfection. While he initially cast aside the notion as blasphemous, Fabius convinces Fulgrim to allow him to continue his studies into the possibility of enhancing the gene seed of the Astartes. As the war drew to a conclusion, Fulgrim passed on to his commanders that a portion of the Legion would be required to remain in the sector at the War Master's request, to ensure newly won territory did not fall out of compliance, while the rest travelled to join his brother Ferrus Manus and the 10th Legion Iron Hands in their latest campaign against a race of Xenos associates known as the Disparax. Fulgrim himself would lead the assault on the final atoll, while the Leia fought with even greater ferocity than before. Their resistance seemed to melt away as the Emperor's children approached its centre. It was here that Fulgrim would find the monstrous twin-spired temple in a hidden valley, and the truth of the Leia would be revealed, although to the Emperor's children, the bull-headed, multi-limbed statues with their piercings and bared breasts were not recognisable as being in dedication to Slaanesh, nor the writhing mass of Leia engaged in a great orgy beneath them representative of that yet unknown deity. If only the Emperor had warned them of what he knew, maybe the fate of Fulgrim and his legion would have been very different. As Fulgrim strode towards a raised dais and the silver sword that had him transfixed, the undulating mass of the Leia parted to allow his passing, and he drew that sword and sealed all their doom. Not only that, but casualties amongst the Emperor's children had been unexpectedly high also. On joining up with Ferrus Manus' Iron Hands, while his Primarch enjoyed his reunion with his brother and planned the campaign to come, Fabius would take a different path to ensure the secrecy of his experiments. With the ending of the costly war on Leoran, the steady stream of casualties to the Apothecarian had greatly reduced, allowing Fabius more time to dedicate to his research. In order to achieve the privacy the delicate nature of his work demanded, he had relocated to a small research facility aboard the strike cruiser Andronius, under the authority of Lord Commander Eidolon. Eidolon escorted Fabius to the research facility personally, and revealed the secret laboratory lined with incubation tanks and surgical tables, from which Fabius would work on his pursuit of genetic perfection. When Fabius questioned this personal attention, Eidolon revealed he was to undertake a peacekeeping mission aboard the Proud Heart. He was not enamored with this assignment, judging it to be a waste of his talent to be sent away from the fleet. However, being made aware of the scope and nature of Fabius's work by Fulgrim himself, Eidolon saw an opportunity to turn that knowledge to his advantage. He offered himself up as a test subject on his return to the main fleet for the enhancements Fabius was making to Astartes' physiology, the goal to become the indispensable right hand of the Primarch. Over the weeks and months that followed, Fabius worked with his usual industry on both the corpses and severely wounded casualties that came across his tables. His portable Chirurgeon kit, a near-permanent fixture attached to the servo harness at his waist. The clicking steel arms like metal spider legs reached over his shoulders, each bearing syringes, scalpels and bone saws that assisted with the dissections and the organ removals. The stench of blood and cauterized flesh filled the laboratory constantly, but to Fabius they just spoke of thrilling discoveries and journeys into the unknown reaches of forbidden knowledge. He had incubation tanks to mature the gene seed he had altered through genetic manipulation, chemical stimulation, and controlled irradiation. And while Fabius had met with more failures than successes, the balance was gradually shifting towards the positive. Now the war had provided him with a steady source of gene seed upon which to experiment. The furnaces of the Apothecarian had burned night and day, disposing of the waste of his failed experiments. But these blows to progress were necessary for his and the Emperor's children's pursuit of perfection. He knew there were those in the Legion who would recoil from the work he was doing, but they were without vision and could not see the great things he would achieve, the necessary evils that must be endured to reach perfection. By taking the next step in the Astartes' evolutionary journey, Fulgrim's Legion would become the greatest warriors of the Emperor's armies, and the name of Fabius would be celebrated the length and breadth of the Imperium as the chief architect of this elevation. An accidental discovery would become incredibly pivotal in the descent of the Emperor's children, as Fabius uncovered the means to link the nervous system with the pleasure centers of the brain of a living Astartes. With this knowledge, Fabius was able to turn the sensation of each painful incision he was making into one of joyous delight. In the Apothecarian's incubation tanks, the nascent fruits of his experiments, tiny budding organs floated in nutrient-rich suspension. Tissue samples from Astartes who had fallen allowed Fabius to create a superior osmodula that would increase ossification of a warrior's skeleton, resulting in bones that were virtually unbreakable. And he'd managed to combine elements of the Leia hormones, which would alter the Betcher's gland, allowing Astartes to replicate the sonic shriek of the Leia. His work on refining other organs was only just beginning, but Fabius was working on enhancing the Bioscopia to stimulate muscle growth, and the multispectral eyes of the Leia had provided a great deal of information he hoped to incorporate into the experiments he had begun on the oculobe. His first major success was a drug he had synthesized from a genetic splice between a gland taken from the Leia that replicated the functions of the thyroid gland and the Bioscopia. In test subjects, Fabius had found the metabolic rate and strength had increased markedly before their deaths, and refinement of the drug had kept these increases from overloading the recipient's heart, and now it was ready for distribution to the Legion en masse. Fulgrim had authorized the use of the drug, and within days it would be coursing through the blood of every warrior who chose to take it. We can see that with Fulgrim under the whispered influence of the demon sword, Fabius now had a free hand in turning his genius to improving the physical stature of the Emperor's children, and the use of Xenos genetic material and extracts in both his organ enhancements and serums was already well accepted. The next move forward is when Lord Commander Eidolon returns back to the fleet after the war on murder against the Mega Arachnids, alongside the Lunar Wolves and the Blood Angels. Despite the glories Eidolon boastfully claims from his decision to drop onto murder before the arrival of the supporting forces to rescue the Blood Angels, his pride has still been slighted by being sent away from the fleet. As he had requested, Eidolon would soon find himself in the tender care of Apothecary Fabius, the Chirurgeon device slotted into the interface unit mounted at his waist, and plugged in with connectors that meshed with his own senses. The surgery he was about to perform was best kept from the eyes of those in the Legion who might balk at what he must do to succeed. Eidolon confirms that the majority of the captains under his command will be volunteering shortly to undergo augmentative surgery. Despite the powerful soporifics mixing with chemicals of Fabius's own devising, Eidolon would show some final reluctance, especially when informed the modified tracheal implants that would allow him to produce the nerve-paralyzing shriek of the lair came from strands taken from the alien genome combined with Astartes' gene seed and mutated under controlled conditions, but his protests fell on deaf ears. With Fulgrim's authorization to perform his surgeries, and Eidolon having made his desire to be his greatest success, Fabius says he will deliver on his promise. He also cautions him not to threaten him again, as he'll be under the apothecary's knife many more times during the crusade to come, and he will be a model for how the Legion is to take the next evolutionary step forward. We see that the surgery was successful, as in a conflict with the Eldar led by Eldrand, Eidolon is said to have been able to produce an undulating howl of nerve-shredding ferocity that ruptured the Xenos helmets and caused effects similar to powerful seizures. As Fulgrim continued to fall under the influence of Slaanesh, and he becomes more detached from the goings-on in the ranks of the Emperor's children, Fabius is able to continue his work improving the Legion with impunity. The next notable patient on Fabius's surgical table would be Captain Marius Varagian. He too would receive the tracheal implant, but also the further auditory augmentation that would eventually lead him to commanding what would become the Cacophonii, the first Noise Marines. Fulgrim is instructed to rendezvous with Horus after the events on Davin, and when he boards the Vengeful Spirit, he takes Fabius as part of his small delegation. This is possibly the first time that Fabius is introduced formally to the War Master. Confronted by the allegations laid against him by the Council of Terra, Horus and Erebus spoke to Fulgrim for 3 days, telling him what had befallen the 63rd expedition on Davin, the treachery of Ugen Temba, the assault on the crashed glory of Terra, and the necrotic possession that had taken his flesh, after being wounded by the weapon known as the Anathema. Fabius is allowed to retrieve the weapon from the Vengeful Spirit's medical deck, and take it into the possession of the Emperor's children. Horus then told him the truth of his injury, and how he had indeed almost died. But of his time in the Delphos, the massive temple structure on Davin, he said little, save that his eyes had been opened to great truths, and the monstrous deception that had been perpetrated upon them by their father. The bond between the Primarchs is strong, and with the whispered encouragement of the demon attempting to possess him, Fulgrim pledges himself and his legion to the traitor's cause. Following the meeting with Horus, Fulgrim's fleet took the 4-week journey to the Kalinides system. Lord Commander Vespasian brought his concerns about the path the Legion was taking to the Primarch, noting that he was sullen and withdrawn, and as more of Apothecary Fabius's chemicals were introduced to the Legion's blood, the decline in their moral fibre appeared clear. He was repeatedly denied an audience with Fulgrim, and with the Primarch and Eidolon sanctioning the use of Fabius's stimulants and surgical enhancements, he was finding himself more and more in a minority of those who still held to the Legion's founding ideals. Unfortunately for Vespasian, this would be his last act of resistance, as Fulgrim slew him with the anathema blade. Fulgrim would then split his legion in preparation for the events to come in the Istvan system, with a small force travelling with Fulgrim to join Ferrus Manus and the Iron Hands, while the rest rejoined Horus's 63rd expedition under the command of Ildion. Fulgrim was intent on convincing the Iron Hands Primarch to join their cause, and Ildion was tasked with seeing those elements not likely to follow their new vision to make sure that they were sent to the slaughter on the surface of Istvan III. Both Fabius and Marius accompanied Fulgrim, and the full effect of Fabius's surgeries on Marius were becoming apparent and show how Fabius was honing his abilities. Ever since going under the knives of Fabius, Marius had felt as though his skin were a prison for the universe of sensation that seethed in the meat and bone of his body. Every emotion brought him an ecstasy of joy, and every hurt a spasm of pleasure, very suitable for those who would fall to the Dark Prince. Every one of his officers and many of the fighting Astartes had been sent to the Andronicus for chemical and surgical enhancement after him, and the demands on Apothecary Fabius had become so great that he'd even established an entirely new corps of augmentative chirurgeons to meet the Legion's requirements for enhancements. Fulgrim would fail in his attempts to persuade Ferrus Manus to join the traitors, and in the duel that follows he bests his brother and leaves him broken but alive despite the urgings of the demon. Positioned amongst the Iron Hand's ships, the Pride of the Emperor and the vessels accompanying her were able to cripple and becalm the 10th Legion's fleet as they made their journey to Istvan. With the massacre on Istvan III, the remaining Emperor's children now revelled in the War Master's strength of purpose. Fulgrim and his Astartes would spend more time engaging in debauched pleasures, as in La Feniche preparations for Bequa Kinsha's performance of Maravigula reached new heights of wonder and decadence. In the attempt to replicate the sounds of the Leia Temple, Bequa would develop the musical devices that Marius and his retinue would combine with the enhancements of Fabius to become the Cacophoni. Although well within Fulgrim's inner circle, Fabius himself would not be drawn into the indulgences of the rest of the Legion. He remained focused on his personal mission to continue enhancing his brothers in what he saw as the next stage of their evolution. Still working from his lab on the Andronicus, Fabius would next operate on the newly promoted Lord Commander Lucius, after his betrayal of loyalist elements on Istvan III brought him back into the Primarch's favour. He would not be present for the performance of Maraviglia, that saw the Emperor's children welcome the presence of demons openly into their midst. The combination of the events in La Feniche and Fabius's ministrations meant that the Emperor's children that battled the loyalist chapters of the Iron Hands, Raven Guards and Salamanders on Istvan V were already far removed from the noble Astartes they once were. Marius Varasian now had a monstrous distension of his jaws, locking his mouth open in a constant howling scream. Where his ears had been, 2 great gashes were carved in his flesh, and his eyes were stitched open, forever prevented from closing. His throat had fleshy sacs much like an amphibian to amplify his vocal weaponry, and in time further sonic devices would be implanted directly into his flesh. In others, like Julian Caliceron, the external changes would be less obvious, but Fabius's work on altering and heightening the sensory nervous responses within the Legion, combined with the many serums and stimulants he was providing, would make their fall to the indulgences of the Dark Prince all the swifter. On Istvan V, Chief Apothecary Fabius picked his way through the carnage like a vulture, pausing here and there at a fallen Astartes to perform some gruesome extraction. A coterie of warriors protected him, and hideous homunculi assisted him in his loathsome labours, the fruits of which were borne behind him in a procession of blood-stained organ-bearers. From the bodies of the fallen on Istvan V, Fabius would create his floor-length coat of flayed human skin, covered with the tortured features of those who saw the approach of the skinner's knife while still alive. It's also believed that by this time he had devised his Zyklos Needler, a weapon of his own creation with the intention of being able to test any new genetically engineered serums under battlefield conditions. As the name suggests, it fired thin, capillary tube shards imbued with Fabius's latest creations, and the effects varied greatly with the toxin contained within. With the killing of Ferrus Manus on Istvan V, Fulgrim would succumb to the voice of the demon which had whispered in his ear since he first drew the silver sword in the Lair Temple. The demon would take temporary possession of Fulgrim as the Primarch's consciousness allowed the demon in. It was sometime shortly after this that Fabius completed his latest self-examination. With his now much improved chirurgeon connected via a series of cables linked to his neural implants, he was able to perform the internal examination with total control while remaining inured to the pain of the operation through a strong anesthetic. His prognosis was bleak. He found evidence of degradation in every organ and projected his life expectancy as less than a solar year, the regenerative capabilities of his Astartes physiology completely compromised. It must be at this point, if not before, that Fabius would have started looking for ways in which he could himself endure. His many self-surgeries had left him now with heavy stitching cross-hatching his skin, which was permanently thin and sallow. His face even more skeletal and drawn, with eyes now becoming dark much like his Primarch's, and surrounded by chasms of dark skin. His hair was thinning and coming out in clumps. Fabius was still keeping his condition secret, and using an elixir distilled from a concoction of restorative enzymes and proteins rendered from transhuman donors to hide the worst ravages of the illness on his body. It leaves him vital and renewed, his cognition, physical strength, endurance, and stamina all enhanced. But it's a falsehood, a balm for an untreatable illness. Following the events on Istvan, Horus orders Fulgrim to take the Emperor's children to Mars, but instead he directs the fleet towards the Mechanicum world of Prismatica. When Ildilon questions this, he is executed summarily by Fulgrim. Before leaving the War Master's fleet, Horus is visited by Alfarius of the Alpha Legion, who presents him with a data crystal stolen from the Raven Guard. Corax had retrieved genetic data on the creation of the Primarchs from Terra that he had hoped to use to rebuild his legion after the drop site massacre. Alfarius and the agents working for him had corrupted the data, foiling the Raven Guard's plans, but also making sure the Primarch data he handed to Horus was incomplete, and in his eyes virtually useless, although it is likely he underestimated the genius of Fabius in being able to expand on Corax's incomplete research. Back on the Pride of the Emperor, Fulgrim's recent actions led Lucius to call for an assembly of the Brotherhood of the Phoenix, and surprisingly, Fabius sides with him in his belief that an entity has taken possession of the Primarch's body. When questioned by the others, Fabius states he has observed a change in the composition of his flesh. As though his molecular structure had begun to dissolve, Fabius felt that he was preparing for some great ascension, a shedding of a redundant form, and his flesh to be remade into something extraordinary. Fabius insists the changes to Fulgrim are progressing rapidly, but there is a possibility they could be arrested if they acted quickly. They agree to do so, and this leads to Fabius, Lucius, Marius, and Julius being able to subdue Fulgrim and begin the process of attempting to exorcise the demon through reason, threats, but mainly pain. When one of them questions if they're even capable of inflicting pain on a Primarch, Fabius' response is to smile a reptilian grin and promise a host of pains he alone knew. Fabius leads their attempts to exorcise the demon from Fulgrim, and alongside his more conventional tortures he uses a neural parasite-based device he created, which would in theory allow him to take control of Fulgrim's mind to some extent. Of course, the intervention is all an elaborate ruse that Fabius may himself had been party to. They had succeeded only because Fulgrim had desired it, had wanted them to come to this point. He had seen the doubts in his warriors, and had led them to this place, in order to reveal his true nature. That in his grief after killing the Gorgon, a servant of the Dark Prince had took his flesh for his own amusement. But in time, he claimed it was a simple matter to reclaim his body and cast the demon into the prison it had crafted for Fulgrim. The portrait painted by Serena de Angelis following her corruption having visited the Lair Temple. Fabius's laboratory aboard the Andronicus has changed significantly by this point, and was now a place of wonders and revelation, where the secrets of life and death were laid bare by the slice of his blade, and exposed to his towering intellect. Scavenging the battlefields of his newborn rebellion, the progenoids cut from the flesh of the living and the dead of Istvan V had furnished Fabius with the genetic master key to 7 of the Emperor's legions, the code sequences that would form the basis of his ultimate revelation, the secrets of the Emperor himself. Fabius was tasked with the resurrection of Ildilon, and is able to succeed in reattaching the Lord Commander's head and reanimating his body. But at Fabius's promise, every instant of his life from that point would be a symphony of pain and pleasure. On joining up with Perturabo's Iron Warriors, Fulgrim is presented with 2 captured Imperial fists. These captives would soon find themselves in Fabius's Vivisectora, where he proudly shows his collection of samples taken from Astartes from 11 different legions, both traitor and loyalists. Fabius is particularly happy to now have possession of Dawn's gene seed, feeling it will be the closest to the Emperor himself, compared to the other legions he has sampled. Fabius was now also experimenting further with his surgeries, removing and replacing limbs and organs with parts from other organisms, and testing pathogens, retroviruses and gene splices that were introduced via piston-driven injections directly into the heart of his Astartes test subjects, the results observed and recorded. The perversities of the Emperor's children are even making some of their traitorous allies uneasy, and a delegation of Iron Warriors are the first to come across what Fabius calls his Terrata. The deformed monstrosities created aboard the Adronicus would be used in combat soon enough, as they would take part in the boarding action on an Iron Hands vessel called the Sisypheme. They were a howling mass of twisted flesh and sutured armour that vomited forth from the boarding torpedo that impacted. No 2 of them were alike, hybrid things of glistening flesh and distorted anatomies. Their limbs were elongated, bladed, or chained. They moved with astounding speed, some on limbs like organic piston springs, others on ruddy haunches. Although these Terrata were the greatest of his creations, they were all consuming themselves. Extreme metabolic rates vociferously devoured the nutrient matter that sustained the physiological changes wrought upon their flesh. The chemical gruel they were fed was supposed to be enough to keep them sustained, but too many collapsed and died under the stresses of combat, enough to convince Fabius that something was wrong with his underlying gene coding. While attempting to retrieve a device known as the Heart of Iron from the ship, Fabius is interrupted and mortally wounded by a legionary from the Raven Guard known as Sharakin. Fabius is saved from death by his Terrata and Marius's Cacophoni before using the arrival of the dreadnought Bombastus to make their escape. The crew of the Sisypheme are then able to break free from the traitors, being allowed to do so by Perturabo, and cripple the Adronicus in the process. The Emperor's children and the Iron Warriors would move on to the Elder Crone world of Indios, and the citadel of Amon Ni Sac Kelis. Fabius himself does not have much to do with the combined assault. Instead, he busies himself, now aboard the Pride of the Emperor, with his previous lab lost with the destruction of the Adronicus. Of the Terrata that took part on the assault on the Iron Hands vessel, very few survived, although 2 that did were those test subjects that were originally legionaries of the Imperial Fists. They also appear to have retained some of their higher brain functions, and this intrigues Fabius greatly. While Fabius continued his work, Fulgrim was enacting his plan. Having lured Perturabo deep into the labyrinth, Fulgrim finally reveals his intention to sacrifice his brother in order to ascend to demonhood. Although Fulgrim does not kill Perturabo as he had intended, he is still able to ascend and become a prince of the Neverborn. When Fulgrim returns to the Pride of the Emperor, Fabius has had some setbacks, losing many of his genetic samples to a laboratory fire that was caused by the 2 mutated Imperial Fists, whose resistance he had found so promising. He is aided by the resurrected Lucius, although unlike Ildion, it has not been Fabius that has brought the swordsman back from the dead. After the events on Idris, the Emperor's children largely devolve into disparate warbands, and with Fulgrim now fully ascended to the ranks of the demon princes, his own movements are slightly unclear. Fabius remained busily employed aboard the Pride of the Emperor, with Fulgrim for at least some of this time, his focus now increasingly moving into cloning, and particularly the use of Corax's stolen research in order to produce clones of the Primarchs. By returning to the pride of the Emperor, he had had to sacrifice certain freedoms he'd had to experiment that he had not been bound by on the Andronicus, but Fulgrim had much to occupy him at this point. His latest fascination was having Fabius create clones of Ferrus Manus. Fulgrim would reenact his attempts to sway the Gorgon to the traitor's cause, but each time the conversation would end with Fulgrim slaying the clone of his brother. Fabius would be chided by his gene sire for the imperfections of the clones, and will call him an unpleasant creature, full of bile. Whether seeking closure or just torturing himself, Fulgrim's preoccupation with his cloned brother meant Fabius could operate more or less with impunity. In a hidden antechamber deep in the bowels of the ship, Fabius had dozens of incubation caskets, each containing his Primarch experiments in varying degrees of evolution and genetic success. In the final casket, he had what could become an even greater success in his attempts at the Gorgon, an infant child with a tiny birthmark on the small of its back, a clone of the War Master himself. When Horus calls the traitor Primarchs to muster at Ullanor, Fulgrim does not answer the summons to gather his fractured legion. He is far too preoccupied with the delights of the Palace of Slanesh, and it takes the intervention of Lorgar and Zerdu Leak, using the demon's true name to bind his will and get him to rejoin the traitors. Fulgrim sends out the call, piercing time and space and vibrating through the gene-laced blood of his sons. The ships of the Emperor's children answer their Primarch's call, and Fabius would rejoin with his legion for the journey to Terra and the siege of the Imperial Palace. He had always regarded himself as unique amongst the Emperor's children, dating back to before being reunited with Fulgrim. Now even more so, as whenever he flayed a subject or pinned back its flesh to reveal its internal organs, there was an end in mind. Knowledge. Reason. It separated him from his more self-indulgent brothers. Fabius still desired sensation. He wanted to experience all of it, but he wanted to do that forever. He also knew that his great work would take time. Millennia perhaps, despite the fact he had already made significant progress. But for now, his focus would need to turn to the opportunities for discovery ahead as the traitors made their way towards the heart of the Imperium. The Emperor's children and their Primarch would be very different creatures to the noble Astartes they once were, and Fabius's role in that transformation cannot be understated. I hope you've enjoyed the first chapter in this exploration of the genius of Fabius Bile, and I'll see you again in the near future, where there is only war.